The Soviet Union did not plan to win World War III. It planned to make sure it never started. From the late 1950s onward, Moscow invested enormous resources into a strategy where victory meant nothing happened. No invasion. No decisive battle. No final shot fired. Only a permanent state of tension, calibrated fear, and the quiet understanding that one wrong move could erase entire societies. This was not a peace strategy. It was not restraint. It was a form of warfare where the weapon was not explosion, but hesitation. Why would a military power deliberately build a system it hoped would never be used? Why would generals accept a strategy where success left no visible proof? And what kind of command structure willingly bet its survival on the assumption that the enemy would always blink first? Because this was not about defeating an opponent on the battlefield. It was about occupying their decision-making space forever. And once that logic was accepted, retreat was no longer an option. You don't fight this kind of war to win. You fight it to make sure no one dares to start fighting at all. The strategic problem facing the Soviet Union was not how to defeat the United States in a conventional war. That question had already become obsolete. By the time nuclear weapons matured into deployable systems, total war had crossed a threshold where winning no longer meant survival. Any large-scale conflict between superpowers would destroy not just armies, but the political, economic, and social systems those armies existed to protect. This created a paradox no military doctrine was prepared for. How do you compete with an enemy you cannot afford to defeat? How do you defend yourself when defense itself risks annihilation? And how do you project power when using that power would invalidate every objective you claim to defend? The Soviet response was not a refinement of traditional warfare. It was a rejection of it. Instead of asking, "How do we fight?" they asked a colder question. How do we make fighting irrational? That shift is what makes this strategy fundamentally unconventional. The goal was no longer battlefield advantage. It was behavioral control at the strategic level, forcing the opponent to self-limit, to second-guess escalation, to internalize fear as a permanent constraint on action. This was not deterrence as a slogan. It was deterrence as a system, military, political, industrial, psychological, engineered to function indefinitely. And once such a system is built, it cannot simply be turned off. Because the moment fear stops working, the war everyone avoided becomes unavoidable. To understand how the Soviet Union arrived at this logic, we first need to understand the strategic map they were trapped inside. The Cold War did not begin as a nuclear standoff. It evolved into one because every alternative collapsed under its own weight. On one side stood the Soviet Union, territorially vast, demographically large, industrially resilient, but economically strained and strategically exposed. On the other stood the United States and its allies, technologically advanced, economically dominant, geographically buffered, and embedded in a global network of bases and partnerships. This was not a symmetric contest. And Moscow understood that early. Conventional parity was never stable. The Soviet military could field mass, but mass required logistics. Logistics required time. Time favored the side with global supply chains, maritime dominance, and economic depth. A long conventional war would not just be costly. It would be structurally unwinnable. At the same time, political constraints eliminated preemptive solutions. Any overt attempt to dismantle Western power through force would unify alliances, justify escalation, and trigger responses far beyond the battlefield. The Soviet Union faced a narrowing corridor of viable choices. It could not attack first without catastrophic consequences. It could not fall behind without becoming strategically irrelevant. And it could not disengage without conceding influence across multiple regions simultaneously. This produced a strategic environment defined by compression. Every decision had to account for multiple theaters at once. Europe, where proximity magnified risk. Asia, where proxy conflicts bled resources. And the nuclear domain, where minutes replaced months as the decisive unit of time. The most dangerous constraint was not military. It was temporal. Nuclear weapons collapsed decision-making windows. Detection, interpretation, authorization, and response were forced into timelines shorter than political deliberation could safely handle. In this environment, misinterpretation became as lethal as intent. And here lay the enemy's most significant blind spot. Western doctrine assumed escalation could be controlled through signaling, negotiation, and proportional response. It treated nuclear weapons as extensions of conventional deterrence logic. The Soviet leadership did not share that confidence. From Moscow's perspective, escalation was not a ladder. It was a cliff. Once crossed, there was no guarantee of stopping short of catastrophe. This difference in assumption mattered. Because if one side believes escalation can be managed, and the other believes it cannot, then the side that fears escalation more deeply will design its strategy to prevent the ladder from being climbed at all. That meant redefining the battlefield. Not as territory to be seized, but as decisions that must never be taken. The strategic map was no longer geographic. It was cognitive. And inside that map, traditional military doctrine offered no safe path forward. To see why, we have to examine what the normal playbook would have demanded, and why following it would have led directly to disaster. Traditional military doctrine offered clear answers. They were just unusable. At its core, classical strategy assumes three things: that force can be applied incrementally, that escalation can be controlled, and that victory produces a stable political outcome. In a nuclear environment, all three assumptions break down. The normal playbook would have pushed the Soviet Union toward one of two paths. The first was conventional superiority. Build larger armies. Field more armor. Prepare for decisive ground engagements in Europe. On paper, this seemed logical. In reality, it was a trap. A conventional buildup required permanent mobilization. Mobilization required economic sacrifice. And prolonged economic strain favored the side with deeper markets, maritime access, and alliance burden sharing. Even worse, conventional escalation invited preemption. If war appeared inevitable, striking first would become rational for both sides. The second doctrinal path was escalation dominance. The idea that by climbing the escalation ladder faster, one side could coerce the other into backing down. This logic worked in limited wars. It failed catastrophically at the nuclear level. Escalation dominance assumes rational breaks. It assumes both sides share the same red lines. It assumes that signaling is interpreted correctly under pressure. None of these assumptions were reliable. From the Soviet perspective, escalation dominance was not strength. It was exposure. The faster escalation moved, the less time there was for correction. The fewer actors involved, the higher the chance of irreversible error. And once nuclear weapons entered the equation, proportionality lost meaning. A limited nuclear exchange was not a smaller war. It was a doorway to an uncontrollable one. This created a doctrinal dead end. If the Soviet Union followed conventional logic, it would bleed itself dry or provoke preemption. If it followed escalation logic, it would gamble survival on perfect interpretation under extreme stress. Neither option was acceptable. So the leadership was forced to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. Winning could no longer be defined as defeating the enemy. Because defeating the enemy risked self-destruction. The real objective had to shift. Not to victory, but to preventing decision. If escalation itself could be made irrational, politically, militarily, psychologically, then the conflict could be contained without being fought. This was not a refinement of doctrine. It was a break from it. The question was no longer how to fight within the rules. It was how to design a system where the rules could not be invoked without catastrophe. That realization did not emerge cleanly. It was resisted, debated, and deeply controversial inside the Soviet command structure. Because accepting it meant embracing a strategy where success looked like inaction, and failure looked like the end of everything. The next step was deciding whether such a strategy could even exist, and if so, who would dare to propose it. This strategy did not appear fully formed. It emerged under pressure, resistance, and internal contradiction. Within the Soviet system, proposing a strategy built on not fighting was politically dangerous. Military institutions exist to prepare for war. Admitting that war itself had become unusable sounded, to many, like ideological retreat. The early resistance was not moral. It was structural. Generals trained for maneuver warfare distrusted strategies that produced no operational plans. Industrial planners worried about building weapons designed never to be fired. Political leaders feared losing control over a force whose only proof of effectiveness was fear itself. The question was blunt. If we are not planning to fight, what exactly are we building? The answer required abandoning a core assumption: that military power must translate into battlefield options. Instead, a smaller group of strategists began arguing something far more unsettling: that nuclear weapons were not tools of war. They were constraints on war. And constraints only work if they are absolute. This led to the first critical assumption. Assumption 1: escalation cannot be controlled once it crosses the nuclear threshold. This was not universally accepted. Western theorists often treated escalation as a ladder. The Soviet view increasingly treated it as a cliff. If escalation could not be managed, then deterrence had to focus on preventing the first step, not managing the steps after. The second assumption followed naturally. Assumption 2: deterrence must function automatically, not politically. Political decision-making was slow. Human judgment was inconsistent. In a nuclear timeline measured in minutes, hesitation itself became a vulnerability. This did not mean removing humans entirely. It meant designing systems where the default outcome of aggression was unacceptable, regardless of intent. The third assumption was the most controversial. Assumption 3: credibility requires visible commitment to catastrophe. To deter effectively, the Soviet Union had to convince the enemy that it would accept mutual destruction rather than defeat. Not as rhetoric, but as an embedded property of its force posture, command structure, and deployment logic. This was where internal opposition peaked. Because committing to deterrence at this level meant accepting a terrifying trade-off. You gain strategic stability at the cost of tying national survival to machines, procedures, and assumptions that must never fail. Once these assumptions were accepted, the strategic target became clear. This was not an attack on enemy territory. It was an attack on enemy confidence in escalation. The goal was to make every aggressive option terminate in the same unacceptable endpoint. Not through threat alone, but through architecture, force posture, alert status, redundancy, dispersal, second strike survivability. Each element reinforced the same message: there is no safe way forward. This was not brilliance in the traditional sense. It was a calculated narrowing of possibilities. And once the system began to take shape, there was no partial commitment. Because half-built deterrence does not deter. It invites testing. The real danger began when theory met reality, when this abstract logic had to be translated into systems, logistics, and daily operations that could not afford to fail. Once the decision was made, theory stopped being the problem. Execution became the danger. A deterrence strategy only works if it functions every hour of every day, across decades, without visible use. That requirement is brutal. It transforms nuclear forces from weapons into infrastructure. An always-on system that must remain credible under peace, crisis, confusion, and error. The first challenge was operational posture. The Soviet Union could not rely on a single strike capability. A deterrent that can be neutralized invites temptation. So survivability became the organizing principle. Dispersed forces, hardened silos, mobile launch platforms, submarine-based systems hidden under layers of uncertainty. Each layer existed to solve one problem: ensuring that no enemy calculation could eliminate retaliation. But survivability introduced a second problem: control. The more dispersed the force, the harder it becomes to command. The more autonomous the units, the greater the risk of misinterpretation or unauthorized action. This was not a theoretical concern. It was a daily operational tension. To maintain credibility, forces had to remain on alert. Alert status compressed reaction times. Compressed timelines reduced opportunities for verification. Every safeguard added friction. Every friction reduced responsiveness. There was no optimal balance. Only trade-offs. Logistics turned deterrence into a continuous production cycle. Weapons that are never used still age. Fuel degrades. Electronics fail. Communication links corrode. Maintaining readiness meant constant inspection, replacement, training, and testing. All without ever demonstrating the system in combat. This created a paradox of visibility. If the system was invisible, it might be doubted. If it was too visible, it might provoke. Exercises had to be convincing but not escalatory. Signals had to be legible but not hysterical. Every movement risked misreading. And then there was the human layer. Crews trained for missions they hoped would never come. Operators rehearsed procedures where hesitation could mean annihilation. But action could mean the same. This produced a specific psychological strain. Not fear of combat. Fear of error. A single misinterpreted signal. A faulty sensor. A delayed confirmation. The system was designed to remove discretion under time pressure. Yet still depended on human judgment at critical junctions. That contradiction never went away. The final risk was structural. A strategy built on never being used accumulates hidden fragility. Success conceals failure modes. Near misses leave no public trace. The longer deterrence works, the more confidence it breeds. And the more catastrophic a breakdown would be. This was the price of stability. And it placed enormous weight on one assumption: that the opponent would interpret the system the way it was intended. But deterrence does not fail when weapons malfunction. It fails when perceptions diverge. And that failure always begins on the other side of the equation. Deterrence only exists in the mind of the opponent. Everything else is preparation. From the outside, the Soviet system appeared rigid, opaque, and deeply threatening. From the inside, it was calibrated, defensive, and obsessed with preventing miscalculation. This asymmetry of perception mattered more than any missile count. Western command structures interpreted Soviet behavior through a familiar lens. Force posture was read as intent. Alert levels were read as aggression. Silence was read as concealment. The assumption was simple. If a system looks offensive, it probably is. But this assumption collided with a different strategic logic. The Soviet posture was not designed to enable initiative. It was designed to deny confidence. When forces were dispersed, it was not to prepare a surprise strike, but to make preemption irrational. When alert levels were high, it was not to signal imminence, but to shorten the gap between survival and retaliation. This distinction was subtle. And under pressure, subtlety disappears. The first major misinterpretation came from doctrinal inheritance. Western escalation theory assumed controllability. That crises could be managed step by step. That signaling could clarify intentions before catastrophe. Soviet doctrine rejected this premise. To Moscow, escalation was not a ladder to be climbed carefully. It was a structural collapse waiting to happen. This difference produced a dangerous feedback loop. Western planners believed firmness reduced risk. Soviet planners believed firmness increased it. Each side responded rationally to its own assumptions, and irrationally to the others. The second failure point was organizational. Western systems favored transparency and debate. Multiple agencies, overlapping authorities, and civilian oversight were meant to reduce error. The Soviet system favored compression. Fewer voices. Shorter chains. Faster execution. Neither approach was inherently superior. But each side misread the other's structure as either recklessness or indecision. A rapid Soviet response was seen as hair-trigger aggression. A delayed Western response was seen as preparation for escalation. Both interpretations were wrong. And both increased anxiety. The third and most dangerous misinterpretation involved intent under ambiguity. Deterrence relies on the enemy believing you might act, but not believing you want to. That line is fragile. Soviet signaling often erred on the side of severity. Ambiguity was used as a shield. But ambiguity also invites projection. In several crises, Western analysts filled gaps in information with worst-case logic. They assumed planning where there was contingency, coordination where there was redundancy, aggression where there was fear of surprise. This is where deterrence nearly breaks. Not because one side wants war, but because both sides begin to believe the other has accepted it. The final distortion came from success itself. Because nuclear war never happened. Each side retroactively interpreted its own behavior as correct. Near misses were reclassified as proof of stability. Luck was mistaken for design. But deterrence does not announce when it almost fails. The system worked. But not because it was understood. It worked because fear outweighed confidence on both sides. And that balance was never guaranteed. The absence of catastrophe created the illusion of control. But the true cost of this strategy was paid elsewhere, slowly, quietly, and without resolution. The outcome of the Soviet deterrence strategy is often summarized in a single sentence. There was no nuclear war. That sentence is accurate and deeply misleading. Because deterrence did not eliminate conflict. It rearranged where conflict was allowed to exist and where it was forbidden. At the highest level, the strategy succeeded. Direct confrontation between superpowers became politically irrational. Total war disappeared as a usable option. But that success came with consequences that unfolded across decades. The first cost was strategic stagnation. When escalation is prohibited at the top, pressure flows downward. Conflict did not vanish. It migrated. Proxy wars intensified. Peripheral regions absorbed violence that central theaters could not. Local populations paid the price for stability elsewhere. This was not accidental. It was a structural outcome. Deterrence froze the center of the system. The edges became unstable by design. The second cost was institutional rigidity. A strategy built to prevent disaster resists adaptation. Change introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty undermines credibility. So systems hardened. Doctrines became dogma. Force postures persisted even as conditions shifted. Questioning deterrence logic became politically risky, even when strategic realities evolved. Over time, this rigidity reduced flexibility. It narrowed the range of acceptable responses. And it amplified the consequences of misalignment between doctrine and reality. The third cost was internal. Deterrence centralized authority around existential decisions. Control over nuclear forces meant control over national survival. This concentration of power altered civil-military relations. It privileged secrecy over accountability. Speed over deliberation. The system demanded trust, but offered few mechanisms to verify it. That imbalance did not collapse states overnight. But it reshaped governance in subtle, enduring ways. The fourth cost was psychological. Living under permanent existential threat changes decision-making. Risk tolerance shifts. Fear becomes normalized. Leaders train themselves to think in terms of worst cases. Entire institutions optimized for avoiding catastrophe rather than pursuing opportunity. This produced caution. But also paralysis. Innovation slowed where it threatened stability. Bold moves became suspect. The system protected survival at the expense of strategic imagination. Finally, there was the cost that never materialized, and therefore never received full scrutiny. The strategy assumed that catastrophic failure was always possible, but unlikely. That assumption held, but it was never tested. And that is the most unsettling outcome of all. Because deterrence does not prove itself through success. It survives by avoiding proof. If it had failed, the failure would have been total. No after-action report. No lesson learned. The Soviet strategy worked, but only under conditions that could not be guaranteed. It demanded perfect restraint, flawless interpretation, and uninterrupted control. And history rarely offers those. So the final question is not whether this strategy prevented war. It is whether it created a form of stability too fragile to endure repetition. This strategy was never truly about nuclear weapons. They were the medium, not the message. At its core, the Soviet approach was an attempt to solve a problem that traditional strategy could not. How to preserve power in a system where using power destroys its own purpose. The first lesson is structural, not moral. This strategy worked because it redefined victory. Victory was no longer territorial gain, regime change, or military defeat. It was constraint. The Soviet Union did not aim to win confrontations. It aimed to make certain confrontations impossible. That shift breaks a foundational rule of military thinking. That force exists to be applied. Here, force existed to be believed. The second lesson concerns assumptions. Deterrence rests on a fragile stack of beliefs. That the enemy values survival. That leadership remains rational under stress. That systems transmit signals accurately. And that time pressure does not distort judgment beyond recovery. None of these assumptions are guaranteed. They are contextual. The Soviet system treated them as constants. That was its greatest strength. And its deepest vulnerability. Because the moment any one assumption weakens, the entire structure becomes unstable. The third lesson is about systems thinking. This was not a single decision. It was an ecosystem. Doctrine, industrial capacity, command and control, political authority, and psychological conditioning all had to align. If even one layer lagged behind, credibility eroded. This is why the strategy was so expensive. Not financially alone, but organizationally. It demanded permanent coherence from a system that was never designed for flexibility. The fourth lesson is the most uncomfortable. Deterrence is often described as peace through strength. In reality, it is peace through mutual hostage-taking. Each side's restraint depends on the other's fear. Stability is produced not by trust, but by shared vulnerability. This kind of stability does not resolve conflict. It suspends it. And suspension accumulates pressure. The final lesson concerns repetition. This strategy cannot simply be copied. It worked in a specific historical window. Between actors with comparable destructive capacity, clear lines of authority, and a shared understanding of existential risk. Outside those conditions, the logic breaks down. Deterrence fails when actors fragment. When command structures blur. When ideological commitment outweighs survival instinct. Or when technology accelerates decision cycles beyond human correction. The Soviet Union bet that none of those failures would occur simultaneously. It won that bet. But only once. And that may be the most important takeaway of all. This was not a universal solution. It was a historically contingent answer to an unrepeatable problem. A strategy that functioned precisely because it was never tested. And could never survive being proven wrong. The war that never happened still shaped the world. Not through destruction, but through the constant threat of it. The Soviet Union's nuclear strategy is often remembered as a success simply because it avoided the worst outcome. No cities erased. No final countdown completed. But that framing misses the point. This was not a strategy designed to end a conflict. It was designed to lock the conflict into a permanent state of suspension. The absence of war was not peace. It was a condition that had to be constantly produced. Through readiness, fear, secrecy, and the quiet acceptance that catastrophe was always one misstep away. What makes this strategy unsettling is not its scale of destruction. It is its logic. A system where safety depends on everyone believing that disaster is inevitable if restraint fails. A system where success leaves no evidence, only silence. A system where learning is impossible, because failure would erase the learner. The Soviet leadership did not choose this path because it was elegant. They chose it because every conventional alternative had collapsed. They built a strategy that removed victory from the equation. And replaced it with survival as the only measurable outcome. That choice reshaped global politics, military doctrine, and the psychology of power for generations. It also left behind a question that has never been fully answered. If stability can only be achieved by threatening irreversible destruction, is that stability real? Or merely deferred collapse? The Cold War ended without a nuclear exchange. But the strategic architecture it produced did not disappear. It remains embedded in how states think about deterrence, escalation, and control. And it continues to influence decisions in a world where the original assumptions, clear hierarchies, shared fears, rational actors, are steadily eroding. The Soviet Union used fear instead of war. Not as a shortcut, but as a last resort. It worked. Once. Whether it can ever work again is a question history has not yet answered. And may not allow to be tested a second time.